You're listening to Adapt or Die. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at where industries are falling short in demand forecasting. To help me with that conversation, I'd like to introduce Matt Deshawn. The Vice President of Industry Strategy at LlamaSoft, Matt not only brings a wealth of experience from the supply chain software space, but he's also run the supply chains of some of the largest restaurants out there. Matt, it's great to have you here today to talk a little bit about forecasting and planning, especially with your background in this industry. By way of introduction, tell us a story about how you got into this business to begin with.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Great to be on today. Believe it or not, almost 20 years ago, I got a degree in logistics management and supply chain, right? Big field, lots of different areas you can go into it. And I got early in my career into consulting, supply chain design. Then I moved into a software company space where I got to see lots of different technologies and kind of be on the cutting edge of forecasting, demand planning, production scheduling, all this constraint-based, optimized with solvers, hitting a wide variety of companies' problems. And after about 4 years in that space, I moved into industry, right? So it was nice to see, here's kind of coming out of college, I got this consulting background, I go to one of these large ERP companies, I see this best of breed, like how it can be done, cutting edge, and then I go in industry. And it was completely a tale of two cities, right?
But that's funny because you probably aspired to industry thinking that here's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. I'm going to take all this stuff that I learned and apply it in a place that we're ready to lead whatever it is we do. Tell us a little about the industry you went into and what it was like when you got there.
Yeah, it was great. I went into QSR as an industry, quick serve restaurant. I think generally people call it fast food, but it's a QSR space. And when you look at different industries, and I've worked with many different industries over the last 20 years, from a supply chain maturity model and a planning standpoint, they're not at the forefront of the supply chain. They're all about the restaurant, the customer experience, and supply chain is more of an afterthought, right? So I went to work at headquarters of a large brand that had, we'll say, close to 3,500 restaurants. And they had a lot of supply chain challenges, right? They were missing fill rates, let's call them, with the customers. So the restaurant was stocking out of a lot of ingredients. But at the same time restaurants were stocking out, you had distributors that were throwing away ingredients that were expiring. Because in the food business, you've got shelf life, right? You've got things that you make sauces, you make components, and you've got maybe 3 months from manufacture to expiration date. They've got to be chilled. Some of them are room temperature. So you are throwing a lot of inventory away at the distribution center level, but you've got customers in your restaurants who you can't fill their orders because you don't have the right product for them.
Wait a second, though. This isn't exactly a high-margin industry either, and it's not like there's no competition in quick service restaurants and fast food. You're telling me that they basically just threw inventory at their vast network of stores. Based on what? How were they getting to that forecast? What were they doing to understand what those stores needed?
Yeah, so you're spot on. And before I go to that, you say, it's not a high-margin business. This is the industry where I learned the term penny profit. And when they came to market with new items, they'd put a bill together. Like, this is the penny profit we're going to make on an item. So you're right. You're dealing in pennies of profit per item sold. It's a very low-margin business. And a lot of work went into going to market with test markets, analytical methods. The marketing department was very well advanced on doing media buys, reading point of sale data, but it really boiled down to what I talked about when I was in software about siloed information, right? And my first step into corporate America was being in a corporation that was more siloed than any corporation I saw, just because historically that's how the brand grew up, right? They had marketing in one building. Literally a different group in the building was purchasing, which was I worked for, now is supply chain. And they were in a different building in a different location, right? So it was literally all this work, these statistical methods, reading of point of sale data got boiled down into one email from marketing that said we went to market with this, we tested it over 5 weeks, and in this large market area, on average, each store sold 50 of these sandwiches a day. And that literally went in an email to the supply chain purchasing department, and then they sent that email to their suppliers. So everyone's trying to take a guessing game on what that really means, right? What's even on that? What is even on that bill of materials for that sandwich, right? And what are the case packs of those different materials? And everyone was just guessing. So throwing inventory at the problem, yeah, we threw inventories in in distribution centers. And then store managers who had a history of running short, well, you better get it while it's in the DC, right? So had all these restaurants over ordering, right? And then some restaurants would go to order and the distribution center would be stocked out like the first week of a promotion, which caused mass panic. And that would spread like wildfire, which even caused restaurants to order more, right? We got to get it while it lasts. And then from a food safety standpoint, then you had franchisees putting food in trunks of managers' cars, shuttling them between restaurants, which is definitely not something we want to do. And of course, it was shelf-stable stuff, but not something you really consider a best practice, right?
Yeah, especially with things that generally you want to keep temperature controlled, to your point earlier.
Sure, absolutely.
I just want to unpack that a little bit. So it all started with your marketing department leading the way, maybe introducing a new product, setting up a promotion timeline. Maybe it was something tied to a certain time of the year. And then they just kind of threw a number over the wall saying that average from a test market or a test store was representative of 3,600 stores. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
But an average is by no means going to reflect what's going on in the real world. So I imagine in some markets you had shortages, but in other markets you had a bunch of inventory that you just threw away. What were the tools that you used to quantify that or measure that? Did it matter?
So, yeah, it did matter because you had an organization of franchisees who are very successful. And in order to get a purchase price, right? Like your restaurant's not going to negotiate contract food prices on a national basis, right? So the franchisees, many, many years, decades ago, set up a cooperative and they paid a certain amount to join this purchasing cooperative and buy off the contracted prices, right? Worked very, very successfully. Where it became an issue is the annual dues the stores were paying at a restaurant level to join the cooperative was actually less than each restaurant was paying every year to write off expired food to the distributors. And that became a huge issue, right? Like, I'm paying you to be my supply chain organization so I get these discounts and get the contract pricing and volumes of scale and assured supply, but yet the inventory that's rotting, that's getting thrown out these distribution centers that never even makes it in my restaurant, costs me more than it is to be part of this purchasing function, right? So that became a very large, imagine a political issue, right? So it was kind of nice. They brought me in. They're like, hey, Matt, you come from software. You come from kind of the state of the art. Here's your laptop, writing off $1 million. Just go fix that thing, right? Which is probably one of the best job descriptions you could give me. Like, just go tackle it and get it done.
What did you use to do that?
So I used the most amazing, standardized, prevalent supply chain planning tool in the nation, in the world, which is Microsoft Excel.
Wait a second. Microsoft Excel, which was introduced in, 87?
Right.
So a 30-year-old piece of software that's really not meant for mass databases was the solution. Is that pretty common in this industry?
It's common, and luckily, because I was a consultant, I had an extra arrow in my quiver. I used Microsoft Access, right?
Well,
so
getting serious database software.
Right, very serious database software. But it was usable, and it created less errors. So we got through some of the, someone sorted a spreadsheet wrong. And as I work with companies today, very few analysts use standardized SQL code. It's still really done in spreadsheets, right? Which is unfortunate, but it is the situation we're in right now.
That's really a manual process still. It's not that different from sending an email over the wall to the other guys telling him, what the plan is. If you're in Excel, what are some of the issues? I mean, to me, it seems multiple versions all of a sudden got distributed everywhere. The data might not be able to keep up with the pace of change that you're depending on probably some really sophisticated macros that maybe the software itself can't handle. That's still a massive challenge for companies today, then?
It is a massive challenge, and everyone knows that spreadsheet that we'll call him Bob created, who's got all this tribal knowledge of the organization, and someone new on boards with the company, and they get this spreadsheet. There's no instructions. There's no user manual with it. They don't even know which set of data do I input and where are the formulas and how does that impact the second tab and the third tab, right? So there's this person that's usually in the organization who's the master, who created it, who built it, kind of that mad scientist, precursor of data scientist who built this elaborate spreadsheet, and it functions.
Sure, you probably have
right?
some epic Gantt charts as a result of it.
Absolutely. You put data in, you run some macros, and you get data out, but it's not a scalable process, right? It's not repeatable in the stance of, hey, what did we do last month? Can we go take a look at that archival? I don't know, we've already updated the workbook. We don't even have that anymore, right? It's gone. And the panic lies in of, well, we have an extra copy on the server. Why? Well, once we opened up the workbook and we got a macro error and the spreadsheet was corrupt, we couldn't even open it. And luckily, someone had emailed it to themselves a week before, and then we lost the week's version. So now, like in our standard operating procedure, Bob knows that every Friday he's got to save a copy to this special place in the server that no one touches, just in case this spreadsheet gets corrupt, right? And this is what I see in multi-billion-dollar household name companies. And that's where kind of the realization was. I come out of university, I learn all these great, methods and supply chain theory. I go into consulting and apply some of that. I go into a software company and I see all these great applications that have hundreds of customers and great user bases. Then I go into industry and I'm like, this is something really different. It's like they're not even aware that these things exist, right? And that was the dichotomy that I saw. And it was interesting because for me, it was basic blocking and tackling. Like, we're not trying to do something new and revolutionary here, right? We're not, I get not wanting to be an early adopter. I get when a customer or prospect says, or myself when I go to buy something, I don't want to be the first, right?
What I have works.
Right. I don't want to be the first, but if hundreds of people are doing it or thousands of people are already doing it, then it's innately much less risky, right? I'm not climbing the mountain for the first time. There's a path. It's a known. We know what to do to get to the top of the mountain successfully, right?
Right. Even the fast follower is benefiting from the mistakes made by the early adopter, and it's human nature, I guess, right?
Yeah, it is human nature. So just this week, actually, I was with a household name, high-tech electronic manufacturer, very well sought after company. And we were walking through their forecasting process and with them from a supply chain forecasting standpoint. And they walked through and I said, you've got a nice monthly process here. What statistical engine are you using? And the guy raised his hand. He's like, I'm the statistical engine. I'm like, huh? Oh yeah, we've got 6 forecasters and we kind of look at what we did last year. We sit around, we take some notes and we try to look at trends and patterns. And then, my summary was they kind of divine the forecast, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar high-tech electronic manufacturer. And they said they created a non-biased forecast. And that was the organization's non-biased forecast. Then they pass it over to marketing and sales to add their expertise, which becomes bias. And it may be very valid bias, right? But it becomes bias. So I looked at him and said, so kind of tongue-in-cheek, I'm saying this, you're generating a non-biased forecast, but it's based on your bias.
Well, you're saying it's the most biased group.
Right.
Speaking as a marketer.
Sure.
You're always going to hope for good outcomes and
absolutely.
put in your own sort of frame of mind over, the benefits of your product, especially if you're marketing. Right. But it doesn't seem sustainable to be able to do that. And also it doesn't seem like it's capturing a very long-term picture of what your forecast or what your demand really is. Are they just looking at near-term results to predict short-term outcomes?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, companies are looking at next quarter what I'm going to sell. Because most supply chain lead times, there's some examples where you have 6-month lead times, but most lead times are weeks or months in most industries, okay? There's granted exceptions and complexities. So when they're looking at the forecast, they know they only have to look forward a little bit longer than their longest lead times. So if I'm looking forward to 3 or 4 months and I'm forecasting, I still have time to respond and make purchase orders and bring materials in. So rarely do I see companies looking out past 12 months. Looking out 18 months is what I see most often, even in a sales and operations planning standpoint. But looking out 2 years and beyond, it just really doesn't happen, right? And I sit down with companies and they're like, we're operating a supply chain today that wasn't designed to operate in the environment we see ourselves in, because there's all these changes that were happening outside of our company, and we couldn't leverage those and utilize those in our forecasting process because we're only looking 3 or 4 months out, trying to figure out what we're going to sell in the next few days and make sure we have materials available. Very tactical, operationally focused mindset. Very valid, right? That's what most supply chain people do. They're there to, fight the fires. They're there when things don't go right to make sure they're solving those problems. So it's not invalid, the process. I think that you need to have a much longer term view of what's going to happen so I can design and have a supply chain that can function really well 2 years from now. So I'm not fighting as many fires.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that if you are just in the business of firefighting, you're not really changing the supply chain into something that can help drive profits, that can help grow the business sustainably. That becomes a much bigger thing than a cost center that is simply shoveled a couple raw numbers to sort out at the end of the day, to your original anecdote.
Even from an annual operating plan, right? A lot of people are forecasting and they're looking at what I'm going to sell in the next year. Oh, and guess what's the base of what I'm going to sell next year? Corporate has given us and set the expectation with the street that we're going to grow 10%. So then that 10% just becomes an allocation down through the ranks. And I was running supply chain in a very large global chemical manufacturing company. And we would go through a forecasting process with sales. And the term they used is budget. Well, my sales budget is X, and it was magic. Every salesperson's forecast at the beginning of the year was exactly what their budget or quota was for the whole year. I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. I mean, well, if we give management a number that doesn't align with what they want us to sell, we got a lot of explaining to do, right? So we're not going to put a number in there that doesn't align. And actually, we'll put a little bit more than we're tasked with selling because everyone will be happy with the numbers. And then you can imagine, Matt, that then gets turned around and pushed to supply chain to plan, buy raw materials, and execute on, which doesn't exactly align with the sales orders when they start coming in. And that's when all the problems start, right? And the problems materialize internally for a company. But for me, it's really looking from a customer standpoint, right? You're doing a lot of internal things, but you're losing sight of the customer. Because the whole reason our company exists, the manufacturing company, is to satisfy customers' demand. When an order comes in, we need to satisfy it, right? So it's trying to get away from that internal emotional bias. And, I grew up with a Carnegie Mellon chemical engineer for a dad, right? So I grew up on data-driven decisions, right? Get back to the data. What does the data say? And it's weird. I'm like turning into my father, right? as I'm in this.
It happens to all of us.
I opened the front door the other day and I saw a kid in a bicycle. Get off my lawn, right? It's like I'm turning into my dad. It's funny, but that's just anecdotal. But from a data-driven standpoint, that's really where it's at. I was reading an article today by McKinsey, and they referenced artificial intelligence and data science and the shifts companies have to make to be successful. And one of the three main shifts companies have to make is data-driven decisions, right? Getting back to data and taking out the emotional bias and the we think it's going to be this way. We're just going to kind of divine it, and getting back to numbers, getting back to data and being able to say, this is why we made that decision. And from forecasting that's critical, right? That baseline is critical, that you can justify it and it's based in reality.
Okay, so we've kind of talked through a lot of systemic issues today in the supply chain, common ones. And maybe we look at them as issues, but a lot of these businesses are just looking at them as the way things get done. As we start to close out this episode, and perhaps even think about new topics to cover going forward, what's the first step to breaking that cycle? What's the first step to acknowledging that these siloed processes, that these really manual ways of planning and forecasting and running a supply chain need to change?
So the word I'm going to use is exposure. And that's where I think it's this evangelical approach to this, of going into companies and saying, here's what you're doing today. You've built a great process. You've got really smart people, smart minds. They're working hard. They want to make the best decisions. But there's a way that we can move the needle forward in the business, right? What if we looked at this a different way and applied some tools to it and automated a lot of this, made data-driven decisions, and freed your people up to do more value-added things in the supply chain? And I think from a supply chain standpoint, from a chief supply chain officer, from a VP of supply chain, director of supply chain, we're all looking for ways I say we because I used to be in those roles. We're all looking for ways to help our team, one, enjoy their jobs, be less frustrated, and give the business the benefits they're looking for, right? We don't love when the business comes to us and says, hey, this order isn't in stock and my customer is screaming at me and why can't we do this, right? We like smooth sailing, right? So we need to go in and educate them and show them with examples, with case studies. Hey, a company just like you in the same marketplace is having these kind of results. And I think that's what makes a difference and starts those conversations, right? Interesting. Tell me more about that. Just natural curiosity.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. You use the word exposure, but I think what you're getting to is simply different points of view.
That's exactly it, right? Diversity. We all know diversity. You can read studies on it. It gets you a better answer, right? And it's exposure. And how do organizations get exposure? In the case of the quick serve restaurant company I worked for, they brought someone in from the outside with a different experience, a different point of view to help socialize that, help train the organization, educate the organization, hey, there's a better way and here's how we do it. And there's a crawl, walk, run process to that. When you think about organizations, they bring in consultants, they bring in executive advisors, application software companies that have different points of views that can advise the business. So it's crucial to just have a different opinion and an outside influence that can bring those ideas and spark that change process.
Excellent. I'm going to leave the conversation right there because I think that puts us at a really good stopping point where we could dive much deeper into some of these subjects we covered today. So, Matt, thank you very much for joining our podcast today. I look forward to more in the future.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on, Matt.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and thanks to Matt Deshawn for joining me for the conversation. To learn more about Adapt or Die, please visit lumasoft.com/podcast, and be sure to subscribe over at iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast network.